I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle. The show, as most of you know, brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world, and I'm joined as I am every week by Richard Ebeling, former vice president of academic affairs for the Future of Freedom Foundation in our early days, and now the BB&T professor of Free Enterprise Leadership and Ethics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back for another round of Libertarian Angle.
It's always great to be here with you and especially our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, likewise. And thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your comments and your feedback. And if you're new to the Libertarian Angle, come and visit us at fff.org. We've got a daily publication called FFF Daily that we strive to make the best daily libertarian commentary page on the internet. We publish a weekly article by Richard. I've got a daily blog, and all of it from this uncompromising libertarian perspective that we have presented here at FFF for now 28 years. Okay, Richard, we've got big news in the trade front. Now, is it possible, Richard, to see something that is pathetic, sad, and funny at the same time? I mean, it's incredible. Here Trump has, started this big trade war with countries all over the world, claiming that, we're going to win this trade war. Trade wars are easy. And, imposing tariffs willy-nilly. He never goes to Congress and says, hey, may I have permission to impose tariffs? He just says, put some tariffs on that country, then put some tariffs on that country, and we're going to win. We're going to beat them on the trade war battlefield. Well, not surprisingly, everybody starts retaliating. China retaliates, Europe retaliates, Canada retaliates, Mexico retaliates, and they're not dumb. They start targeting the areas where Trump's support is the biggest, his political support. And one of those is the farmers. And sure enough, farmers are now complaining that they are hurting really bad because of the retaliatory measures that Trump's tariffs have put on them. The retaliatory measures that other countries are doing. And some of these farmers are really hurting. I mean, like maybe even possibility of going under from reduced sales. And here's the sad, pathetic, and funny part. Guess what his response is? A welfare program. Mr. Republican, Mr. Conservative has now announced that he's going to have a welfare program totaling $12 billion to give to the farmers to tide them over. Now, he calls the farmers patriots because he says they're willing to do this. They're willing to withstand some suffering for our country. But in the meantime, we're going to take welfare from a government whose spending is out of control. I mean, we all know the amount of the debt, the deficit, but somehow or another, he finds another $12 billion in a welfare program to give to these farmers. So they're going to just be writing them a check and say, here, take your welfare check, and we're going to win this trade war. Richard, have you ever seen anything so pathetic, sad, and funny at the same time?
Well, I would be more impressed with Trump's own patriotism if he would offer to use billions of his own money and hand it out as a free, voluntary, private contribution to those who are feeling his pain due to his trade barriers. But I expect that he's just going to do what he has said and use this fund that seems to exist in the Department of Agriculture as a carryover from anti-Great Depression New Deal policies of the early 1930s. Talk about pulling something out of the bottom of the grab bag to sort of rationalize doing something and using taxpayers' money. But there's a number of elements of this I'd like to sort of amplify and complement what you said. First of all, notice how undermining of the federal system of government Trump's policies on this issue really is. The purse strings begin in the House of Representatives. Every spending bill is supposed to begin in the House of Representatives, then passes to the Senate. Then there's a reconciliation, and then it's revoted, and whatever the compromise bill was that may have passed both houses goes to the desk of the president for his signature. The imposing of tariffs used to require the consent of the Congress as well. But now, over not just Trump, he's just sort of the current end result of this, of decades of the concentration of more and more executive authority and discretion in the hands of the occupant of the White House. These things are done just by his caprice. The steel and aluminum tariffs back in March, then the imposition of the $32 billion of tariffs against Chinese goods, then his threat to impose possibly up to $500 billion of more tariffs against China, his declaring that now with the farmers seemingly not going to be financially hurt because the Chinese have responded with their retaliatory tariffs, as you emphasized, targeting those parts of the U.S. economy that have had concentration of Trump supporters as reflected in voting patterns in 2016. What does he now do using executive authority from this New Deal era to just be able, without support, approval or consent of Congress, just allocate $12 billion? Now, it is true, Republicans have spoken out against this, at least some of the Republicans in Congress. That, as you were saying, one of them said, first you put these farmers on welfare, and then you spend the money on the welfare that they need. Another one referred to it as a version of the American style of Soviet central planning, where the government increasingly regulates, controls, and redistributes. The problem is the Republicans aren't willing to challenge or reconsider this executive power overreach in terms of the traditional notions of the division of powers in the Constitution. They're just going to go along with it with a few verbal protests because it's their president and they have an election coming up in November. And they don't want the wrath of Trump to come down upon them and not support him or to criticize them. Like in a primary election for the House of Representatives here in South Carolina, the incumbent, Mark Sanford, was defeated partly because Trump supported his opponent in that primary. The wrath of Trump. Now, the other element of this, for those who are too old to catch it, that's a playoff on an old Star Trek movie, The Wrath of Khan. But anyway, I'm dating myself. The other element of this brings out an argument that a variety of economists have pointed out over the decades, if not the centuries. And that is one intervention, because of the imbalance and distortions and problems it creates, generates a situation where either the government intervener withdraws the imbalancing and distorting intervention, or has to extend an additional one to try to partly compensate for the economic hardships and problems that the earlier intervention has caused. This is a perfect example of it, a theme that Frederick Bastiat in the 19th century highlighted, certainly in the 20th century, the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises. First, you introduce a tariff. The tariff then harms various American consumers and businessmen who import raw materials. Then the affected country against whom you have striked retaliates. That now impacts on another group of people. And then what becomes the response? Well, rather than allow the hardship to fall upon those that your own tariff has caused, you then introduce a new intervention of welfare redistribution to compensate for the financial losses your earlier tariff intervention and the resulting retaliation have now generated. Now, what is the next step? I just read that Whirlpool, that was being affected in a positive way by the first tariffs that Trump imposed upon Europe. Oh, we're limiting the import of European washing machines. Oh, Whirlpool is happy, protected from the evil foreign washing machine, sitting on top of the world. But now Trump imposes the steel and aluminum tariffs, and guess what? The raw material imports that Whirlpool uses now are far more expensive, and the price of producing the product has increased over $300 per unit, which is eating into their profit margins. So what will come next? Well, if the farmers get a subsidy compensation for the foreign nation's retaliation or the impact of the original tariff, why shouldn't Whirlpool get it? Or why shouldn't any other company that has this negative impact then be at the trough of government redistribution by saying, in a sense, logically, consistently, if him, why not me? And then it continues to snowball in this fashion.
Yeah, it's interesting that you go back to the 1930s. It's incredible that he's pulling on the Roosevelt's New Deal, which was really the watershed period in the economic history of the United States. This was the period in which the U.S. government and the United States got converted from a free market economy to a welfare state way of life. And you had this massive government intervention. One of my favorite books is a book called Three New Deals by a guy named Schivelbusch, Wolfgang Schivelbusch, where Schivelbusch compares Roosevelt's New Deal to the economic philosophy and programs of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany during the 1930s. They were battling the Great Depression too, and Benito Mussolini in Italy. And he shows all the parallels. And of course, then there's that famous letter from Adolf Hitler to Roosevelt via the ambassador that said, I want to commend you on your economic policies because we're doing the same thing here in Germany. And you and I share the same position of the greater good before the interest of the individual. And that really was the philosophy of the New Deal. So here you've got this conservative Republican drawing on one of the programs there. And as you point out, this is just classic dictatorial conduct. I mean, he doesn't go to Congress and say, hey, look, I want a bill appropriating money to these farmers. He just says, I'm going to write them a check because I'm the president. I mean, that's exactly how a dictator acts. That he says, I don't need legislative approval. I don't worry about legislative approval. If I want to put tariffs on that country, I'll do it. If I want to strike a deal with them, I'll do it. I don't need any treaties. I don't need congressional support. And if I want a welfare check to these farmers, I'm going to do that too. Meanwhile, notice how the Republicans and the conservatives, and led by Trump, are calling for welfare reform. Well, what they mean by that is eliminating food stamps. I mean, that's the classic conservative position. We got to get rid of food stamps. Well, here's the irony. The welfare plan for the farmers, I mean, this is the same principle for the people producing the food. But because they vote, because there's a strong lobby, that's why this welfare plan's okay. Because those food stamp recipients, as we all know, tend to vote Democrat. So no big deal to cut their welfare. Now, here's the other funny twist to this, is that all this money is going to be distributed in the run-up to the congressional elections in November. Well, this is like straight out of the Latin American playbook, where, the Latin American candidates, the incumbents start passing out money right on the eve of an election, or benefits like public housing, or promises to do this for people and promises to give them that. I mean, it's just a way to buy votes. And this is a variation on that theme that, elections are coming up. Democrats are threatening to take control of at least maybe the House, maybe the Senate. And, we've got to buy off these farmers with a little bit of welfare. And finally, Richard, let's keep in mind, let's break down what this welfare is. I mean, government doesn't have any money of its own. It has to take money from people. So where is this money coming from? Well, part of it's coming from farmers themselves because they pay income taxes, but then it's coming from the rest of us. It's saying we're going to take your money by force to the IRS to give it to these farmers because they need the money, because we've made this trade war that has cost them their livelihood in terms of making money on their own. So we have to make them dependent wards of the state with the money that we forcibly are taking from you by virtue of the income taxes that you're forced to send to the IRS. What a corrupt system, Richard.
Yeah, the other example that we could use, what is the mindset of this, is that in his other famous book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Adam Smith used what is now a famous metaphor about what he called the man of system, which is what we now call the political paternalist, the social engineer who tries to manage the society. And he says the man of system views society as a great chessboard. and he wishes to move the pawns on the surface of that chessboard into the positions and relationships that he considers good and best. But what the man of system forgets is that each of those pawns on the great chessboard of society is a living, breathing, acting, choosing, dreaming, desiring individual who would prefer to position himself on that great chessboard of society, what he does, where he does it, with whom he interacts, with what goals and purpose in mind, so that it is a spontaneous pattern on the great chessboard of society rather than one that is superimposed from the top down by the hand of the social engineer or the man of system. Think of the mindset that is represented by Trump, and of course every other president in your lifetime and my lifetime and before. But just think of the mindset of Trump. He's saying tariffs are good. He just said that yesterday or the day before. And why does he say this? Because he thinks of society as a great chessboard, and he's positioning people to either get a tariff protection or to impose tariff consequences on other people, and imposing these effects on other nations and the people in those other nations to create the pattern of trade that he considers good and right and fair by his definition of a great America. Now, this is the mentality of the planner. How is Trump any different than the political swamp of all those who have preceded him, Democrats and Republicans, who believe nothing for the freedom and the liberty of the individual, to allow the person to live his own life, to keep his honestly earned wealth, to decide on his own goals and purposes and find the best means to attain them, both by himself and in his free and voluntary interactions with others. So again, to use Smith's metaphor, the generation of the of the patterns and relationships of people on the great chessboard of society are from the bottom up. The people choose where they shall be on the great chessboard of society, rather than Trump arrogantly, presumptuously, with great hubris, doing this to all of us, and then expecting other pieces on the board, that is, other human beings, to have their pockets picked even more, to then redistribute to some of them who grumble that where they've been placed is now hurting them.
Yeah, he really perfectly demonstrates Hayek's term, the fatal conceit.
Yes.
I mean, it's the fatal conceit of the planner. I know what's best for everyone. This is what I'm going to do. I don't need congressional support. I'm just going to do it. And then, as you point out, it's the perfect demonstration of Mises' dictum, too, that one intervention leads to another one. Because, let's face it, it's a disaster. This trade war is a disaster. It's a valuable lesson in what we libertarians have been saying the whole time, that your ideal is a totally free society where there are no tariffs, where there's no trade wars, there's no economic regulations. But okay, we don't live in that kind of society. We live in a society where there is government control. But he has now amplified that control. I mean, people were doing fairly well without this trade war, and we can see how well they were doing by the damage that is now being done to them. Farmers, there's bourbon companies that are being targeted by Europe. There's a BMW plant in the South it looks like they're going to start laying off workers and so forth. So you can tell what we libertarians have been saying, that the more government intervention, the more damage you're going to have. And Trump is demonstrating that now with this. So, what is the solution here to what he's done, to all this damage he's causing? Well, he says the solution is one more intervention. Well, it's not going to stop there. It never stops there. The solution is to say, I was wrong. I'm going to eliminate this trade war. I'm going to bring it to an end. I'm going to unilaterally just drop our trade restrictions. You don't have to negotiate with anybody. You don't need to reach agreements. You don't need a NAFTA and a CAFTA and an agreement with the EU. This is what statists all over the world don't realize, that all you have to do is liberate the American people. And of course, this applies to every country. The worst thing these other countries are doing is retaliating. I mean, the best thing to do is just unilaterally drop all your trade restrictions, liberate your private sector, and that's the secret to economic prosperity. Now, let me digress a minute here on this concept of interventionism that you raised, because I think it's such an important concept that one intervention inevitably leads to another intervention, because the politician is too proud to say, I made a mistake. Let me just eliminate the original intervention. So he starts proceeding down this road to more interventions and more interventions. And so, we see this happening now with trade, but we've seen it, Richard, in the other aspect of border traffic, and that's immigration. I mean, you and I often bring the two subjects together. In fact, you and I co-edited a book called The Case for Free Trade and Open Immigration. And you see this same phenomenon in immigration. They start out with an edict that says you can't come into the United States without official permission. Well, they realize people are ignoring that. They're coming anyway. They see the sign. They say, well, no big deal. Oh, well, now we need border controls. We need border patrol. That doesn't work. Oh, well, we need to make it illegal to hire illegal aliens. Oh, that doesn't work. Oh, we need a border fence. That doesn't work. Well, we need warrantless searches of people's farms and ranches. We need raids on businesses. Now we need a Berlin Wall. Just one intervention after another intervention after another intervention. And each time the crisis just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And what's the solution to this? Well, freedom is the solution. Get rid of all the interventions, and especially the original one that causes all the problems.
Well, precisely because Trump is especially known for his humility and humbleness. I believe you should drop him a note and let him know about this possibility of repealing and reversing what he's done. And I'm sure in his open-minded, undogmatic, non-ego-driven mindset, he will immediately respond in a positive way to what you're suggesting. Oh, you think he would?
Pardon me.
But the one other element, which you were saying, it's going to affect this industry and that industry. This is another fallacy when these trade issues are talked about. It's them versus us. It's America versus China. It's America versus the European Union. It's America versus whoever. But the fact is, there is no such thing as America or China or the European Union. These are merely covering the shorthand terms for a political entity in which there are living tens of millions or hundreds of millions, or in the case of China, over 1 billion individual human beings. And all of these government actions and interventions affect different people in different ways. For example, you mentioned BMW. The BMW factory is down here in Charleston, is not in Charleston, but in South Carolina. Now, South Carolina has become a growing state compared to earlier decades because it has been open, particularly as a right-to-work state and relatively low business taxes, attracting foreign investment. The big Boeing factory was opened here as opposed to being built in Washington state. You have Volvo, you have BMW, you have a whole variety. And these have created employment literally for tens of thousands of people. And the port of Charleston has become a major international port for imports and exports on the east coast of the United States. Now, the fact is that what Donald Trump is doing does not affect all people in the United States the same way. He's asking implicitly for the people of South Carolina to be more patriotic, to use the metaphor you were saying, or bringing out that he said, than other states. The impact will be greater here. Because BMW is thinking of not expanding or cutting back. There's the question of whether the growth in imports and exports that have created an immense amount of jobs and wealth and prosperity, in particularly the low country of South Carolina, will continue to grow in the way it has been once these tariffs impact on it. And then there's this differential effect. It's never them versus us. It's individuals impacted by badly and misguided imposed policies. But the one other thing that needs to be brought out, and that is there are a lot of businesses today and business associations that are either publicly or behind the scenes trying to get Trump to be less aggressive or not to retaliate or not to impose. The problem is that once these tariffs are in place and are in existence for a while, different segments of the U.S. economy will have adapted and adjusted to it. And then anyone who now says, oh, Trump is gone, either whether in 2 years or 6 years, Trump is gone. Let's now reverse this trade war madness. The fight will then be with all of the special interest groups in different corners of the U.S. economy that have been sheltered and grown and become adapted and accommodated to these tariff protections. And then, like in all instances, you then have to fight these networks of special interest groups who don't want the tariffs to be lowered, because in the short run, they now will be hurt, just as in the short run, imposing the tariffs are imposing particular harms on people. So it won't be a matter of, by executive order, he establishes these tariffs, then in 2 or 6 years, we can just abolish them, whether by executive order or through an act of Congress. Special interest groups will come out of the woodwork, who have grown up and become used to being sheltered in various segments and parts of the U.S. economy behind these Trump-imposed trade barriers.
Yeah, and probably this dole that he's now giving out, that's going to be become a semi-permanent thing. The farmers are going to be dependent on it. They're going to say, well, we need to phase this out over a period of time. Our operations are now dependent on the dole. And this is the way that the interventionist state intersects with the welfare state. And it's important also, Richard, I think, to look at the ideal here. And the ideal really is what exists within the domestic, the United States. Now, okay, we're all Americans, but look at it in terms of that each of us lives in a different political jurisdiction, what we call a state. It's entirely conceivable that each state could have the power to do what the United States does, so that where a governor says, I'm going to impose tariffs, governor of Florida, I'm going to impose tariffs on the people of Virginia. I'm going to, any wine that Virginians produce, I'm going to impose a tax. And that's what a tariff is. A tariff is nothing more than a tax. It's like a sales tax. And we could easily have that kind of system. I mean, if it hadn't been for the framers that prohibited this, that's the kind of system we would have. And actually, there's nothing inherent that says that you can't amend the Constitution to allow each state to impose immigration controls as well as trade restrictions. Well, I think most Americans would say, that's not a good idea. But why? Why isn't it a good idea? Well, because people should be free to cross state boundaries, search for a better job, even if it means, out-competing somebody else for that job, selling their goods, buying goods, just pursuing happiness. Notice also that nobody, and I mean nobody, worries about the trade deficit that exists between the different states. I mean, I don't know what the trade deficit is between Florida and Virginia, but I bet you any amount of money, it's not equal. I bet you there's a good chance that there's a lot more people from Virginia going down to Disney World and going down fishing than people coming up here to visit, Arlington National Cemetery. But nobody worries about that. Nobody paces the floors of, oh my gosh, Virginia's going to go broke because we're spending more in Florida than they're spending over here. And so that's those. If people could just see the virtues of these principles applied domestically, apply internationally. That the freer Americans are to buy goods from anywhere in the world, from people who are vying for their business to sell goods and services, the better off they are. They don't have to buy from the Chinese or the French, but to have more choices is something good, not bad. And finally, I think we need to emphasize that it's through trade. Trade is one of the ways that people raise their standard of living. That you can increase your standard of living just by entering into a trade with someone. Because in every trade, you're giving up something you value less for something you value more. So at the instance of the trade, you've improved your position. So even though you may not have factories and stuff like that, if people are free to trade, that means they're free to raise their standard of living in that society.
Yes, and unfortunately, the essence of all of these trade barriers is that somehow poverty makes you better off. That increasing the scarcity of things enhances our wealth. The very purpose of division of labor, the very purpose of interpersonal trade and exchange among people in the same country or among people who by accident of history are on different lines of a political boundary, is that it gives each individual a greater opportunity to improve the quantity of the goods, the quality of the goods, the variety of the goods, and the less expensiveness of the goods than if he had to rely upon the specialization, skills, and the accidents of where resources are located within one's own home area or country, compared to benefiting what everyone can offer in trade as their way to benefit by buying something from us reciprocally. That is the benefit of free trade. It makes the entire world one economic community. The political boundaries might be there, but if it's free trade, they don't matter. The just way is that you're hammering away that in the United States we're, quote, all Americans, but people live in different states: New York, New Jersey, Nevada, Wyoming, Florida, Texas, Arizona, Maine, Idaho, et cetera, et cetera. And even though there are these administrative jurisdictions, even from a classical liberal point of view, right, a local administrative jurisdiction for protection of life and liberty, the enforcement of due process of law and a rule of law, so on and so on. But there are no boundaries or prohibitions or restrictions on the free movement of goods among the states. In fact, while the Commerce Clause of the Constitution has been twisted and abused and bastardized over the last 100 years to justify it being used for government to control and regulate economic activity of people across the country, if you read the constitutional notes of convention notes of James Madison as to why there was added to the Constitution this Commerce Clause, it was primarily the concern that under the Articles of Confederation, under which the 13 states had operated before the Constitution, that in fact these states were setting up trade barriers and trade restrictions among themselves that were harmful and detrimental to the mutual prosperity of all the citizens of the 13 states. And therefore, part of this Constitution was meant to assure a fairly wide and unrestricted free trade zone across the political boundary of the United States. And of course, as the U.S. grew territorially, you now had this 3,000-mile long and 1,500-mile wide piece of global geography that was basically this vast free trade area. Free movement of goods, free movement of money, movement of men. And that is one of the things that, as long as the state remained less intrusive and less grasping with taxes, it enabled Americans, those born here and the waves of immigrants who came for a better life and a second chance for themselves and their family, to bring about prosperity for themselves and mutually for this growing nation as a whole.
Yeah, that's on that fine note. We'll wrap it up. But I think one of the virtues, if we can see something positive out of this, is I think more and more people are going to think about libertarianism and say, these libertarians are right on this issue as well. As things start getting worse and worse and worse, how can a person not think about the virtues of freedom and free trade and free markets that we're talking about here? So, Richard, we got to wrap things up. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I enjoyed the conversation as always, and good to see you again.
Good to see you. And again, as I always try to do, to thank our viewers and listeners for sharing a little bit of their time with us.
Yeah, thank you all again. And come and visit us at fff.org. And we'll see you all next week. Thanks for tuning in.